Straight to it, as always. First up, anti-aliasing is one of the big issues with Monster Hunter Wilds. When set to off, it's a pixelated, jaggedy, flickering mess. Hair looks like white noise. Our next choice is temporal anti-aliasing, also known as TAA, which is often considered one of the blurriest anti-aliasing methods in modern games. It works by blending pixel data across multiple frames. It does a decent job on the jagged edges and is a very performance cheap anti-aliasing method, but it also creates blur, which becomes even worse during motion or dynamic movements. Choosing to add FXAA, or fast approximate anti-aliasing, into the mix works by adding a full screen blur via a post-process filter, meant to reduce those jaggies. There's no jagged lines to remove in this scene, but here's an example where they stand out, and both TAA and FXAA together fail to fix them, even though it's basically blurring the entire screen. Generally, Unreal Engine titles mitigate all of this added blur by balancing it with post-sharpening, but Monster Hunter Wilds skimped on this step. That's okay, we can fix that ourselves by adding some sharpening for a crisp image. That's even better than the off setting. How do we do this? Well, let's start with how not to do it. The in-game Nvidia app lets you adjust the Sharpness Plus feature on the fly without restarting the game. However, it's a simple post-process overlay filter. It's not the best quality, and post-process filters usually cost us a couple of frames. In contrast, using the Nvidia control panel works at the driver level. More importantly, this sharpen feature uses algorithms specifically tailored to counter TAA blur, delivering far superior results with virtually no performance impact. Obviously, use the Program Settings tab so you're not applying this globally. I would recommend about 40% sharpness. You might have to adjust this slightly depending on your monitor and its settings as well, but 40% should be a pretty good starting point for most. Changing the sharpness with this method does require a game restart. Don't be fooled by the two sharpness options. They are both from Nvidia, but they are not the same. The Nvidia control panel is at the driver level and far superior in design. Next, let's circle back to deep learning super sampling, because DLSS not only has its own anti-aliasing method, but also has its own sharpness filter built in. I do strongly recommend not using external sharpness filters on top of DLSS because you'll just get a ghosty mess of over sharpened edges. DLAA is just deep learning anti-aliasing without the upscaling, and it does absolutely fantastic on still images, but does lack during motion. For the upscaling choices, we might as well go straight to quality since there's really no frame loss. Still images are crisp and motion quality is decent. We're gaining frames over DLA. We're gaining frames and visual fidelity over our TAA combined with FXAA and the external sharpening. But here's the real game changer. Using DLSS also enables frame generation, which massively boosts our FPS into a whole new tier. The performance gained from frame generation obliterates the competition on its own, not only in performance, but even visually if you have the hardware for it. Frame generation is locked to 40 and 50 series RTX cards, so use it if you've got the hardware. A 60% FPS boost at 1080p with improved visuals, that's a no-brainer, take advantage. By the way, if you have a 30 series RTX card, you can still use FSR 3.1 and still enable frame generation for similar improvement. For obvious reasons, we will turn DLSS off in order to test the rest of the settings, starting with ray tracing. Is it worth enabling? Let's break it down. Right off the bat, we can skip the low ray tracing setting. It's rough looking and not worth it. The performance gap between medium and high is negligible, often just a single frame per second. So if you're going to use ray tracing, high is the only option to consider. That leaves us with a choice, high or off. Even on high, don't expect flawless visuals. Monster Hunter Wilds uses a performance-oriented ray tracing technique called hybrid ray tracing, which traces fewer light rays and uses lower resolution buffers. This results in reflections that lack fine detail, often appearing blurry or simplistic. Especially at a distance or sharper angles, they only shine when you're up close at a steep angle. Frankly, the reflections feel very underwhelming for the frame rate drop of up to 14%, even on this RTX 4080. High looks decent in close-up moments, but at a distance, reflections lose accuracy and can seem less convincing than the off setting. Surprisingly, off delivers more consistent visuals that often blend better with the biomes like the jungle or desert. The verdict: turn ray tracing off. You'll get a solid performance boost, smoother gameplay, and visuals that stay consistent without the distraction of lackluster reflections. In Wilds, no reflections often look better than subpar ones. Next, texture quality. As always, this setting plays a big role since it can be a video RAM hog needlessly. First thing is a heads up that this VRAM use estimate is pure fiction. You could ignore it as it laughably underestimates actual memory demands. This is actually common in many games. For example, here it's claiming a 7.5 gigabyte VRAM required, which can easily mislead players into setting this texture too high, since it really doesn't take much effort to go way beyond that estimate. And we're already chugging 11 gigabytes of VRAM use next to an estimate of 7.5. Bench tests show a colossal VRAM spike on highest, classic trap in many titles. Visually, the jump from low to medium is night and day, noticeable on this barrel's crisp detail. Same holds true for many textures, including terrain. The high setting is a further improvement, albeit less pronounced. Frame rate barely nudges, with highest sometimes taking a slight hit. Obviously, not from a VRAM bottleneck that kicks in at 90% usage, so stay well below your max. Not all textures are affected by this setting. In all honesty, very few are. But when they are, they do look pretty bad on medium and lower. Your character, your palico, and even NPCs surprisingly don't change with this setting. High is certainly the sweet spot. VRAM use is minor above lower settings, and you get huge texture improvements. The highest setting is a massive VRAM guzzler, and not much in return since it's not optimized correctly. You're literally loading textures into your RAM that don't actually materialize on screen. Plus, it does spike our 0.1% lows, which does risk stutters. Stick with high. It nails the sweet spot for sharp visuals without wasting gigabytes on fluff. Next up, texture filtering quality is the same thing as anisotropic filtering. It sharpens textures viewed at steep angles relative to the camera. Just like in past Monster Hunter titles, despite the funky settings name change. The example on the settings screen is very good at displaying how it doesn't quite deliver as it should. The main difference is noticeable from trilinear to 2x. Beyond that, it's oddly more about tweaking brightness than boosting terrain clarity. In-game, it's the same story. The only true jump shines from trilinear to 2x anisotropic filtering, since trilinear's mip-map blending leaves textures mushy, while 2x samples twice per pixel does make for a crisper pop. This is all greatly overshadowed by lighting and environmental effects that drown out any gains. Even if we try to strip away these effects, it's still not enough to notice the differences. This is mostly due to the anti-aliasing TAA's blurfest wiping out any potential of the higher setting choices here. Weirdly, 16x does ding our FPS a tad in Monster Hunter Wilds, unlike most games where it's a freebie. Stick with 8x, it's the Goldilocks pick for the sharpest textures you can achieve in Monster Hunter Wilds, whether you're playing at 1080p or 4K without wasting any performance. Moving one down, we got mesh quality, which is supposed to increase the polygon count for more detailed models. They advertise a particular improvement in character faces, which is completely untrue. Let's test the exact same face in the exact same location as per their example. Immediately, we see the disconnect between internal testing and the final product. There's zero improvement in the hair or any facial features of a main story character or even our hunter's face. This is the case for all faces, regardless how close they are to the camera. So what does mesh quality actually do? Well, it does increase the polygon count on some objects and walls. Quite subtle, but it is noticeable back here on the wall. Not every object gets the same love. It's kind of a hit or miss, with minor polish when it does hit. Unfortunately, the differences are quite minor. It's subtle, but they do have a clear higher polygon count and less of that blocky Flintstones vibe. During cinematics, same deal. Slight polygon bump on random details, but you'd need to freeze frame to care. Highest, barely a step up from high. Faces, yet again, don't have any change, but some other details do. Frame rate takes a small hit, with the biggest polygon gains from medium to high. High is the sweet spot. Decent detail without chasing those diminishing returns. Fur quality won't improve the quality of fur on your screen regardless how many monkeys we slaughter. It doesn't affect the feathers on our bird or the furs that we wear. Doesn't affect any wildlife or the fur on the bosses we hunt. The best quality fur in the game is likely the fur on our palico, which even without armor and zoomed in, we still notice no difference. Obviously, the frame rate difference is not justified, so the recommendation is going to be low. Next, let's examine sky and cloud quality settings. The lowest option shows a clear drop in detail compared to low, with noticeable blurrier textures. However, there's no visible difference between low and highest. Switching weather patterns yields the same result. Lowest remains slightly blurred, while low to highest deliver identical visual quality. Performance-wise, the FPS impact is minimal, with only a 0 to 2% frame rate drop. The blur on lowest is particularly noticeable against the game's sharper details, making low the recommended setting. It's worth noting that the frame rate dip only occurs when you're looking at the sky, so those minor drops rarely happen. Next, we dive into grass and tree quality, which promises enhanced foliage density. Testing the same environment and tree branches, we see no difference in foliage density across all settings. In this specific scene, the frame rate remains consistent regardless of the setting. However, in areas with denser foliage, we notice a slight but consistent frame rate drop when moving from low to the higher settings. This performance hit isn't justified, as all three settings, low, medium, and high, look identical. I've tested multiple environments to confirm this with no visual graphical improvement to account for the performance cost. The recommendation is clear. Stick with low. If I can't spot a difference, even when actively looking for it, you won't notice one while playing. Next up, grass and tree sway. Introduces wind movement to foliage. Not all foliage is affected, but those that move truly bring the environment to life. Without this setting, the scene feels almost frozen, like the world is on pause. Performance-wise, we see a minor 2 to 3% frame rate drop, but the visual payoff is worth it, adding dynamic movement to the scene. The wind effect on these trees is subtle, but the tall grass sees a significant improvement, swaying naturally. This boost in immersion easily justifies the small performance cost, making the final recommendation enabled. Next up is wind simulation quality, and frankly, this setting does nothing. It doesn't enhance the wind's intensity or improve its visual quality, whether for trees or cloth ribbons. Each type of foliage has its own fixed sway, completely unaffected by the setting. Frame rate tests back this up, showing no change across all options. Additionally, wind simulation quality has no impact on falling leaves, embers, ashes, or any other particle effect. This setting is a complete dud. The recommendation is low. Experience has taught me it's best to avoid enabling broken settings. Next, we have surface quality, which can only be toggled from the title screen before loading the game. Its purpose is to enhance the render quality of terrain and geographical features near the hunter. However, this setting has several drawbacks. The visual improvement is extremely subtle, and most terrain remains unaffected, making the change barely noticeable. Worse still, it consistently impacts frame rate, costing 1 to about 5% of performance across the board. This setting highlights the importance of testing graphic options. You can gain up to 5% frame rate without noticing any visual difference. Their recommendation is clear: set it to low. Diving into the sand and snow quality. Let's kick things off with sand. No matter the setting, sand looks identical. Same texture, same rendering, even footsteps remain unchanged. It's a complete non-factor. Snow, however, is a different story and heavily depends on the location. In some areas, setting anything below high completely disables snow, leaving the ground bare. But there's no visual difference between high and highest. In other locations, snow appears regardless of your setting, as if the game just ignores your choice. When snow is forced, regardless of your setting, it will look flat and lifeless on low and lowest. It's really just a cheap paint job slapped on the ground. Medium introduces a slight sense of depth, while high and highest bring a noticeably richer, more realistic snow texture and depth. Areas with light snowfall, however, don't change no matter what you pick. Performance-wise, the frame rate hit varies by environment, ranging from 3 to 7% drop when snow is active. After weighing the visual gains against the cost, the recommendation is high. Highest offers no extra visual flair, and since the frame rate dip only kicks in during heavy snow scenes, you're rarely sacrificing performance in most environments. And when you are in a snowy region, the improvement is substantial, splashing through to water effects. The setting menu promises it will add fluidity effects to water. Sounds promising, but don't get too excited. Let's start with fishing water, which has some of the best fluidity effects in the game, yet this setting doesn't touch it. The blood red water of Scarlet Forest, no change. Footsteps while splashing through it, still the same. Even the cascading waterfalls remain completely unaffected by this setting. You get the picture. This is another dud that does absolutely nothing. The frame rate tests back this up as well, showing zero impact across both options. Save yourself the hassle, set this one to disabled. Looking at render distance, it doesn't do as much as you might expect. This option has no impact on objects, hills, mountains, cliffs, and all terrain completely unchanged no matter how far you look. The massive monsters you're hunting, untouched by this setting. Instead, it controls how far critters and wildlife render in and out of view. Set it to low, and you'll spot those pesky critters popping in and out in open fields like this. It's distractingly obvious. Medium pushes the render distance far enough that you're very unlikely to notice livestock vanishing. High and highest, they're so far you'd need a telescope to care. Even in bustling areas packed with monsters and wildlife, the performance hit is minimal, costing just a couple of frames. The sweet spot is medium, plenty of range for immersion without wasting frames on high or highest, which add nothing you'd notice mid-hunt. Set it and forget it. Let's tackle shadow quality, a setting that can make or break your Monster Hunter Wilds visuals. Lowest is an easy pass, as it slaps a nasty, grainy texture on shadows that gets uglier the further you look. It's just a pixelated mess, and it's really no better up to and including medium. This setting doesn't just affect shadows in motion, it affects all nearby shadows cast by the sun. including trees, rocks, your palico, your own shadow. So getting it right is key. However, we have to kick this setting up to the highest, not because of the boost in crispiness, but because anything lower causes shadows to update like they're glitching at 1 frame per second. Only the highest setting fixes this. It may be where the FPS drop kicks in, but trust me, the glitchy shadows are horrendous and visually game breaking. It's worth noting that local light sources aren't affected by your setting choice here. Stick to highest, as it's the only choice if you want to hunt in style without glitching visuals. Next, let's zoom into distant shadow quality, which the game defines as quality of shadows far from the hunter. Spoiler alert, this setting does nothing. No matter how far you squint, shadows stay identical across both options. Frame rate tests back this up, 0 FPS change in either direction. I've scoured different environments, scenarios, cinematics, and localized light sources like torches, zilch, nada, just another dud setting to add to the pile. Since the devs put a particularly low amount of effort into this one, it's only fitting we recommend low to match. Next is shadow distance, which does work. It has a very minor effect on the distance at which shadows improve quality. The difference in distance is short enough that it's got 0 impact on frame rate, making it a free visual upgrade. It's not something that stands out at all, but hey, it's basically a free minor visual improvement. Most noticeably, it controls the distance that critters gain shadows. The far setting isn't particularly distant, but that just means the lower options are that much more noticeably horrific. Given the performance impact is negligible, we might as well take the furthest option. It looks a lot better than the lower options and no frame rate cost. Recommendation is far for the longer range shadows. Ambient light quality has some serious quirks. Buckle up for this one. Let's start with a side-by-side just to see the gradual FPS drop from low to high. Visually, a side-by-side comparison for this one just doesn't cover it. But if we flicker back and forth between high and medium, bam, it becomes apparent that the high setting is washing out colors all over the place. As for the background lighting shift, it's just a tweak in the algorithm math. We won't judge this one just yet. From low to medium, we notice the colors aren't being washed out, but the ambient lighting feels slightly dimmer. Let's take another scene with lots of light sources and flicker high to medium. I chose this one because there's a lot going on here, and it highlights why picking a winner between two very different algorithms is rather difficult. Still, all these differences are overshadowed by the washing out of colors. Low to medium seems to share the same math, just toned down, but neither screams winner here. Let's zoom in on high's algorithm in a sunlit scene. On high, we have the sticks all lit up like they are in direct sunlight. On medium, they are shaded like they should be. Baskets on high shine with amped up vibrant colors. But on medium, their lighting appears better suited to their location tucked in the shadows. Then there's our hunter, whose face, and even the shield on her back, blazes like they're under a spotlight on high, totally ignoring the shade. The high settings overzealous glow feels off, blasting harsh light instead of the soft, diffused ambience it's meant to deliver. Sure, there's plenty to nitpick in both directions, but here's the deal. Low takes the crown. It dodges the color washout, and the FPS hits. Next up, contact shadows. Aims to add shadows in key spots to give objects volume and depth. Contact shadows makes objects pop, especially in busy areas full of objects like this. That's a major improvement, but even the more subtle shadows on these carrots, pumpkins, and more come together to add a realistic 3D feel. Without them, scenes lose depth and immersion, feeling flat. It's more subtle, mostly darkening existing shadows instead of creating shadows, but still does boost depth nicely. Performance-wise, it averages out to less than 1% frames for a massive graphical improvement. It's a no-brainer. Recommendation is enabled. Next, we have Ambient Occlusion, which adds soft shadows to most objects and the environment, enhancing depth and realism of 3D scenes. Flick it from off to medium and boom, the scene transforms. This setting is an absolute must to make the visuals immersive. Otherwise, it looks like a cartoon. Frame rate cost for enabling ambient occlusion is surprisingly negligible. Ambient occlusion, of course, doesn't just affect objects, but also the environment and even certain terrain. While it jazzes up everything, objects do steal the show with cozy shadows all over the place. Then there is the high setting, which does not add any additional shadows, but makes a big difference in well-shaded regions, where upping it to high will reduce that color washout back to the more vibrant colors we had on off. It's hard to distinguish in-game because lighting is dynamic and constantly changing with the weather or flickering from torches or such. The settings screen example is actually correct. It's subtle, but the colors on high are less washed out, making the final recommendation high. It's a rare win where killer visual boosts come dirt cheap on performance. It's a must-have for Monster Hunter Wilds. Next, let's talk about bloom. This setting controls the halo effect around the sun. Off has it completely disabled, low enables a subtle glow, while high increases its intensity for a radiant, bold effect. It does not affect the cascading light effects, such as on this mountain. The light will bend around objects, creating a realistic diffusion, but it won't cast additional lighting effects beyond that. Now here's the thing. Bloom's visual boost is subtle. Unless you're pausing to admire the sky or a glowing sunset, you really won't notice it during intense hunting. The good news is, bloom is a particularly lightweight post-process effect, meaning it's almost entirely GPU based and super easy on your GPU, even on older systems. Tests show a negligible performance hit, less than 1% frame rate drop. Plus, bloom only calculates and renders while its effects are needed on screen. In other words, you can consider it auto-disabled for 99% of gameplay when you're focused on monsters and not the sky. Also worth noting, in other games, bloom is often on torches and lamps, but this is not the case in Monster Hunter Wilds. Recommendation on this one is easy. Set bloom to high. It adds a touch of cinematic polish with virtually no performance cost, making your adventure just a tad more immersive. Diving into motion blur, as if this game wasn't already blurry enough with stock settings, motion blur, another post-process effect in Monster Hunter Wilds, blurs fast-moving objects based on their speed relative to the camera position. So rapidly moving your mouse or spinning won't trigger any blur. In cinematics, you'll notice a very subtle blur effect. We'll have to pause to notice. The only good thing about motion blur is that it can reduce the pixelation and other visual issues that are present in Monster Hunter Wilds. For fast-paced gameplay, motion blur is a tough sell because most monitors, even high-end ones, struggle to display crystal clear motion without blur reduction technology. Introducing additional software blur during intense action simply cancels out what we shelled out for those pricey monitors to achieve. Essentially, clarity during motion. Can your monitor display this kind of detail during fast motion? Let me know below, because your opinions do shape my recommendations. During gameplay, motion blur does require quite intense motion, so essentially blur mostly hits at your feet, turning grass, dirt, or textures into low-res smears during quick motion. It just makes the game feel even more muddy. Recommendation: set motion blur to off. It ensures maximum clarity and crisp visuals. It's a post-process shader pass effect, so it won't save us more than a frame or two, but we'll take it as an added bonus. Next up, VIgnette Effect is another post-process effect. Starting with performance, there's virtually no impact and no change in frames per second. This is the case for all environments and situations regardless what's going on. So what does the setting effect do? VIgnette is all about adding a subtle darkening around the edges of your screen meant to draw your eye to the center. It's a cinematic touch, but don't expect a big wow factor. Flipping between on and off still feels so subtle. you might barely notice it. It only affects the game environment and not your user interface. Here's the deal. Vignette's effect is more of a subconscious vibe than a game changer. Recommendation is going to be off unless you prefer that peeking through a keyhole feel. Next, let's shine a light on screen space reflections. You'll need ray tracing set to off to utilize this. Visually, it is a step down from ray tracing in every way. Reflections lack fine detail, look blurry, inaccurate, and often get the colors wrong. When the reflections are dark, it generally provides zero improvement, but still costs us frames. It shines only when reflecting bright things, like the sky or glowing trees. But that's kinda rare. It costs less FPS than ray tracing, but a 2 to 5% drop on high-end GPUs isn't nothing. The issues of screen space reflections far outweigh its benefits. First off, unlike ray tracing, screen space reflections relies solely on the limited data it gets from the frame buffer. This means it only sees what is rendered on screen as data for reflections and colors. So when we tilt the camera, the reflections will vanish abruptly since the necessary reflection data lies outside the screen, creating visuals that feel particularly unnatural during movement. It gets even worse when something obscures the reflection data. A good example is this fishing pole. Screen space reflections reflects what's on screen, but when something like this fishing pole blocks some of the data, screen space reflections will resort to grabbing nearby pixel data and results in this odd artifact of a reflection. In Monster Hunter Wilds, screen space reflections is great in the fact that it'll give us poor reflections for a relatively cheap FPS cost, but it's entirely been replaced and improved by ray tracing in visual quality. Blurry reflections, distracting artifacts, and the frame rate hit, screen space reflections just isn't worth it. Definitely set it to off for a smoother game, and honestly, in Monster Hunter Wilds, the water looks better without reflections. This next one is screen space separable subsurface scattering, which is basically a performance-oriented version of your typical subsurface scattering. The setting's supposed to make materials like characters' skin, fabrics, or foliage pop by mimicking how light scatters beneath the surface for a soft, lifelike glow. And there's even an example of it over here. But in-game, it's a letdown. The effect is so subtle you need a microscope to spot it, even this close up. For some odd reason, the best example of subsurface scattering is the scarf worn by the Keeper's tribe, which is honestly an impressive improvement. But it ends there. The trend doesn't even continue to other fabrics. Subsurface scattering main attraction should be to make faces look more realistic, but it just washes out details. Performance-wise, it's stubbornly persistent and consistent at costing exactly one frame regardless of the environment or location tested. Even in cutscenes, where we're even more zoomed in on the faces, it's somehow even more subtle.
Look, I know what you're going to say.
No, we did this together.
Everyone, great work! We did it!
Stunning make. You did well.
Even this guy is disappointed. Recommendation is to take the free frame and turn off this SSSS setting. Next, let's zoom in on depth of field. Monster Hunter Wilds uses a stripped-down, performance-friendly version of depth of field that blurs objects based solely on their distance from the camera. And our benchmarks show why it's more of a headache than anything. When aiming in focus mode, you'd expect the center of your target to stay sharp with surroundings blurring out. This simplified depth of field only cares about distance. The further something is, the blurrier it gets, even if it's the center of your focus. Closer stuff stays sharp even if you're not looking at it. It doesn't mimic real human vision and feels jarring. Human eyes adjust focus to keep the target focus clear, but Wilds just slaps on a lazy distance blur that breaks immersion. Recommendation, set depth of field to off. You'll get a more consistent, true-to-life immersion and more crisp visuals. Volumetric Fog. You'd expect volumetric fog to add depth, like thicker, dynamic mist rolling through. But in Wilds, it falls short. Performance-wise, it does cost 2 to 3% more FPS, but the visuals don't really change at all. The fog looks nearly identical with it low or high, whether you're in the misty rainforest or the hazy oasis. These tests suggest it's just using a different method of calculating the fog, but the results have differences too subtle to even point out due to the fog's natural randomness. Running the test in caves, where weather effects don't impact the colors as much, we can confirm a very slight difference in fog brightness. Very lackluster. Recommendation is to set volumetric fog to low. You'll save a few precious frames for smoother gameplay, and honestly, fog will look the same. Variable rate shading. This setting reduces shader detail to boost performance. Off is the highest quality option as it gives you full shader quality. Balanced and performance dials it back even more for extra FPS. In theory, variable rate shading should affect detail on most surfaces, but in Monster Hunter Wilds it seems to only affect tiny glowing embers. The halo is slightly less noticeable as we move towards performance, and the shape of some become more square rather than a circle. Very subtle to notice without pausing the game, even at a close proximity. The effect can be noticed on fire embers, of course, only noticeable with a pause and zoom. And it also affects snow, of course, also requiring a pause and the microscope. Performance drop for the top quality setting, which is off, is less than 1% FPS. It's not much, but considering the visuals are not noticeable, we might as well save yet another frame. Recommendation is performance for the free frames. All it takes to keep this channel going and support me making these deep dive setting videos is a quick subscribe and like. If you really want to make me your go-to settings guy for optimizing the settings in all your favorite games, then the donation link in the description will truly expedite my process. Until next time, happy gaming.